The following episode of Critical Weeb Theory has some spoilers for Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and some mild discussion of fascism. Other than that, I hope you enjoy our guests and I hope you enjoy the episode.
So I guess we can get to Miles, who is the Ishvalan that you might have forgotten existed. We meet him fairly late into the series, I'd say around halfway. And he is another Ishvalan, except he is a soldier in the Amestrian military. And his goal, which I guess we'll talk about later, his goal is to change the opinions of Amestrians / the state of Mestris towards Ishvalans to be more positive towards them.
So Miles is Vosh.
Yeah. So I feel.
All right. That is a reference to something, but because of the nature of language, I don't even know what I'm referencing. Do you think the person who first invented the word tree was speaking to some deeper meaning or referencing some ancient concept they were not yet aware of?
I think they just needed a useful sound to describe tree.
Right, but a lot of sounds are made to replicate what they're supposed to represent, right?
Sure.
Welcome back to Semiotics Corner, the only podcast where we talk about nothing but semiotics and symbology for a whole hour. I'm Rakova. Nice to meet you.
This is Mo Black. Hello.
Hi. Sorry, I was really confused. I did not know if that was actually an intro that you'd planned out, or if you were just saying random things. Sorry.
I always make things up every single time.
We're doing improv here.
Okay, because it sounded partly planned and partly not, and I was okay. Sorry. Yes. Hi. I guess.
And this time, that intro was a lie, and you know what else was a lie? The way FMA Brotherhood talks about the Ishvalan genocide.
Wow, what a great lead-in.
Should probably let our guest say her name. See, it's not planned.
Okay, lovely.
All right, hey Sri. Sri is amazing. She's wonderful. Talk about yourself.
Dear God. Hi, I am Shri. I use she, her pronouns. I am a very tired grad student in healthcare, who's kind of, I guess, into anime, and I like talking about my opinions. Haven't really done anything like this before, so hopefully I won't embarrass myself too much, but I am excited to talk about one of my favorite animes of all time. I watched it when I was 15. It was the most magical summer of my life. I guess in terms of storytelling, I just was wow, I want to write stuff like this, or I want to tell stories like this. And and it's apparently fairly popular. It is the wonderful Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. And I'm excited to talk about why it sucks in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no greater feeling than riffing on something you love.
Unlike every other person on the planet, I have not seen Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood because I'm too busy watching more important things like The Rising of the Shield Hero and The Rising of the Shield Hero Season 2.
Listen, there are plenty of people who can tell you what happened in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, but not many people who can tell you in vivid detail exactly what happened in The Rising of the Shield Hero.
That's...
Is that a compliment? No, not really. Anyway, I was about to say, so the downside of talking about Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is that it is... checks notes, 64 episodes long, which is way too long to reasonably summarize in any concise manner. On the upside, it's the most popular anime on Mal, at least until the fascist anime gains popularity and traction.
The goddamn fascism anime. Oh, yes, sorry, continue.
No, nothing to apologize for.
That's an appropriate response to the fascist anime.
In case you ever wondered what the critical weeb theory stance on whether or not Attack on Titan is fascist or not was in question, please remember that Vosh made a video defending it, so that means we're contractually obligated to oppose it. And for that reason alone, not just because it is fascist, but also because Vosh thinks it isn't fascist, and he has to be wrong.
I want to make one of those fake like Wikipedia table of contents where it's like critical weeb theory, party lion, anti-Voshism.
Uphold Marxist-Leninist anti-Voshism. Oh wait, no, Mo's an anarchist. That meme doesn't work anymore. That doesn't. Well, technically it would be Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, anti-Voshism.
It works somewhat. It was funny. MLMAV.
Anyway, I was about to say, the upside is, even if our description is super shitty, it's fine, because most of you have actually probably already seen it. Let's start with a basic premise. In the world of Full Metal Alchemist, everything works upon this idea of alchemy. There are alchemists who can do the alchemy thing.
Ooh.
Yeah. Ooh, I'm turning metal into more metal.
Yes.
But it's in a different shape now. It's cool.
Yes. And it is also supposedly very scientific. It has laws, apparently, which is interesting. It's still pretty magical, I think. I mean, yeah, it's still very magical. But they take it as a science, so...
It's scientific in the same way that, particle physics is scientific. I'm sure there's an explanation somewhere, but I don't get it.
That's actually a really good comparison.
One thing is that in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, there's this state. I think we come to understand that it is effectively a fascist. I don't want to say theocracy, but it kind of is a theocracy, just because the antagonist ends up sort of forming a cult around himself. This is a long series. There's a lot going on. And so they're very state alchemists, and they do things like, wars. And one of the major background events that happened before the beginning of this series was the annexation and brutal colonization of a neighboring territory of Ishval. Sri, if you want to go into explaining what that is and what's going on there.
Yeah, so essentially, the nation, again, it's called Ishval. It was... so we kind of get a sense from the series that obviously, because, of the annexation, there's like pretty tense relationships between Ishval and the rest of Amestris. And so we know that there have been, like riots and like protests and general things. But it was generally quote unquote peaceful. And then we start with one of the biggest events of the series, which in the anime we kind of get. We had one episode kind of centered around it. In the manga, we get an entire volume, which I think was better in some ways. They cut a lot out. But essentially, an event happens where an Amestrian soldier, and Amestris is kind of the main nation where our protagonists are from. So yeah, an Amestrian soldier shoots an Ishvalan child. And I won't touch on this too much, but we kind of learned that the soldier is actually this like shape-shifting monster thing called a homunculus, who does it on purpose for a bunch of kind of like, reasons that are revealed a little bit later on. But this kind of triggers a giant riots and protests and eventually kind of like an all-out war. And we kind of learned that the Ishvalans are generally holding their own in this war, and it extends out for 7 years until the leader of Amestris, he's called Führer King Bradley, who is also a homunculus, by the way, which we learn later, calls an order to deploy these special members of the military called State Alchemists. And the State Alchemists are basically really giant weapons, like huge, huge weapons.
So the State Alchemists are not people. They're like tanks.
Well, no, they're people.
Okay.
They're like alchemists.
But they're people who can do tanks. They're like, imagine if we had a wizard who could shoot fireballs in the modern day.
Okay, yeah, that would be useful for war.
In a sense, state alchemists are at once not weapons, and they are also reduced to weapons by the state as actual means of perpetuating like that's just a part of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood.
Okay.
Talking about the ways in which state uses technological and scientific advances as a means of propagating its own interests. But that's not what we're here to discuss right now, except it kind of is.
Yeah, so you have these state alchemists, and they can do a bunch of different things, right? They have to basically pass an exam, and they have research obligations and stuff they have to fulfill to keep their license, essentially. And so we have a bunch of different kinds, one of whom we'll talk about a little bit later. His name is Roy Mustang. He's kind of known as the hero of Ishval because he had one of the highest body counts in the war. And he, especially against civilians, like people who weren't generally, involved in the actual fighting. I think we see it in the anime, but in the manga, he officially ends the war by killing the last Ishvalan, who's surrendering before him and stuff, but he, does it anyway. And I'll get to this a little bit later, but Roy Mustang is technically someone we're supposed to see as a hero in some ways. Because he's so guilty about what he did.
Yeah, he's definitely a hashtag protagonist.
Yeah, we're supposed to feel bad for him because he feels really bad.
He's trying so hard.
Yes, poor baby.
Poor baby war criminal. Did all of the innocent people you murdered hurt your conscience?
Yeah. So he's kind of the big one. But then there were other state alchemists, and essentially they were responsible for ending the war in kind of an official capacity. So in the aftermath of this, Ishval is basically left as like a shell, super like in ruins, completely destroyed. And the remaining Ishvalans that are left and alive kind of are sort of separate into like slums and areas wherever they can basically set up around Amestris.
It seems rather like relevant to a lot of various political issues.
And it's important to note, before we start pointing out all of the things Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood does wrong, it at least acknowledges that was actually really bad and a horrific war crime, and it should not have happened. Now, the way it handles the people who committed that war crime is perhaps something that needs condemnation. For example, Mustang gets to get away with having done the war crime without actually making any sort of amends to the Ishvalan people. Yeah. He just feels guilty about it, and Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood acts like that's okay.
I see.
But at least it does acknowledge that they did in fact do a war crime, and it was definitely not okay for them to have done that.
Yeah.
So credit where credit is due.
Are we gonna hint at our upcoming Code Geass shitting fest?
Listen, okay, so we need to figure out what we're doing for that, but a part of me just wants to get everyone who was ever on a Critical Weeb Theory episode to contribute at least one Code Geass hot take.
That'd be amazing.
Bonus points if you've never seen Code Geass. It's fine.
Oh yeah, it's better that way.
That's me about most shows.
Yeah, I haven't, or at least I did a really long time ago and I don't remember anything. So
to get back on topic real quick before we digress completely, because I know we will, because there's so many great conversations to have. In addition to just Mustang and the other state alchemists who form the core of our guilty protagonists and the Führer who forms our main antagonist, there are also two other main Ishvalan characters in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. And if you've seen Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, you might be like, wait, I thought there was only one, because you've forgotten the other one.
Oh my gosh.
So let's start with the one everyone remembers. It's Scar. He's a monk whose brother and family were killed by state alchemists, whose role in the story is to first kill state alchemists and then band together with the protagonist to kill the homunculi / father, because he sees the state alchemists as participants in the system that destroyed his entire civilization.
That seems reasonable.
Right? It does sound reasonable, right?
Wait, no. Is he an antagonist? No. Are we doing the anime thing again? Or they make the antagonist the wrong person?
Well, in the beginning, it's complicated.
Yeah, and I also want to clarify real quick that what I just said, I'm reading off of Sri's description and her outline because it's a good outline and a good description. And credit where
Thanks.
credit is due. Anyway, carry on.
Yes, so Scar, who I love with my entire soul and who deserved so much better, and I will never stop being angry about it.
He's a sweet boy who did nothing wrong.
Well, you know, it's really funny because like I say that, and like I've gotten into like very reasonable arguments with friends who think that maybe he did a little bit wrong, but yeah. So to kind of expand on that, so in the beginning he is kind of set up as an antagonist. He goes around basically targeting state alchemists, so that are set up in different parts of Amestris. And he's sort of introduced as this like serial killer, and in the beginning nobody knows why he's targeting state alchemists until I think it's in episode 5. Now we get this giant reveal where he's revealed to be Ishvalan, and so the protagonist Edward Elric, despite not being actively like part of the war because he's like 15 or something now, he's targeted by Scar, and he's again like very clearly set up as that antagonist. Later on, though, he ends up as this kind of greater conspiracy is unveiled, where it's revealed, and I have mixed feelings about this, I don't know if we'll get to this, where it's revealed that Ishval was actually like a setup, not just done by Amestris, but it's kind of like revealed that it was these, homunculi monster people and this like omniscient, godlike figure named Father, who set up this war in the first place for this giant, like, greater like magical scheme to gain more power kind of thing. So Scar ends up teaming up with the protagonists and sort of undergoing this transformation that the series says is, good, because now he's at peace and he's like doing things the proper way instead of, like quote unquote getting revenge. So I guess we can get to Miles, who is the Ishvalan that you might have forgotten existed. We meet him like fairly late into the series, I'd say around halfway. And he is another Ishvalan, except he is a soldier in the Amestrian military. And his goal, which I guess we'll talk about later, his goal is to change the opinions of Amestrians / like the state of Amestris towards Ishvalans to be like more positive towards them.
So Miles is Vosh.
Yeah. So like I feel.
But I feel like so it's really interesting, right? Because as we understand, the point of the entire attack on Ishval was not because Amestrians disliked Ishvalans. It was a blatant power grab in which the state was like, we want your resources. In this case, the resources were human lives, so we will forcibly take them. But here we have Mr. Miles going, nah, like we gotta make them all friendly.
It seems like a hard point for anime to get.
And I think maybe.
I was just about to say it seems like a hard point where like even if anime like feature like things that are like, at least to us, like obviously like systemic problems, like a lot of writers can't wrap their head around the fact that it's not just individuals who have personal problems with each other. Like,
yeah,
I don't know, because if your ideology says, for example, like the U.S. invaded Iraq because because Americans personally did not like Iraqis, then I suppose they're going to write the same way.
Or even like the more insidious version of the U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan for the sake of liberating Muslim women.
Oh yeah, that's a take you'll see a lot.
Now that the U.S. is coming out of Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing that Fullmetal Alchemist, for all of the good it does indulge, at least implicitly, in that idea through the character of Miles, focusing on achieving justice for Ishvalans through working within the system that killed Ishvalans. He's a part of the army. He joined the army that killed Ishvalans. But buddy...
I guess we'll maybe get to this later, depending. But, well, so while he's doing this, and I guess there's 2 points that I can bring up now. So this, like, trying to work within the system thing happens while the genocide is actively happening. So, I mean, you can, like, literally sort of see that what he's doing is like not effective. This is mentioned more in the manga, not in the anime, but I think it's important context that there were other Ishvalans in the Amestrian military. When the genocide or war or whatever started, they were sent off to camps, essentially, just for being Ishvalan and being quote unquote sort of like under suspicion because of that. We also had a lot of former Ishvalan military members like fleeing, trying to get away from Amestris in the first place. Miles was not sent off to one of those camps because he's only part Ishvalan on his grandfather's side. So he has, I guess, a different view in some ways with regard to his identity, and kind of has that privilege of of being able to have this difference and trying to enact it within that system. But it's kind of yikes. Yeah.
So, now that we have our basic understanding, let's talk a little bit more about what does Scar do? What is his grand plan? His people have been genocided. How is he going to like stop that? How is he going to achieve justice?
Yeah. And I guess I can maybe see in some ways how this might be seen as quote unquote just very much attributed to revenge, but I think it's perfectly justified in a lot of ways as well. So he specifically targets state alchemists only. Unless he's like cornered and trapped, he basically won't really hurt civilians or anything like that.
Yeah. He goes again specifically after, and let's be clear, oftentimes these are military personnel who took glee and joy in the murder of Ishvalan civilians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we have like an interaction with one of I think like 4 or 5 that we see in the series who actively were like, oh, I took this many lives in the war and I was this amazing at being, I don't know, a war criminal or something. So yeah, we actively see one of them bragging to Scar, I think, in one of the confrontations. I mean, he's killed by Scar, which, yay. But yeah, like these are like legitimately sort of like Amestris' like weapons of like mass destruction, and Scar like takes them out. So I personally think anyway that there's more than enough justification for that. So he does try to avoid killing civilians as much as possible, but Scar does end up killing 2 doctors within the genocide. And we find out that these doctors are the parents of the protagonist's childhood friend's Winry's parents. And again, this is portrayed as, wanton murdering, and like Scar was just like this evil guy who was helping these doctors who were helping not just the Amestrians out in the field, but also Ishvalans who were brought to their location. And the series does not really give any empathy to Scar in this situation, because when Scar does this, he is on like a bed. He's essentially just lost this is right after his entire family has been killed by a state alchemist in front of his eyes. And he's lost an arm. Brother sacrificed himself with his alchemy knowledge to save Scar and sacrifice himself. So we see him waking up. He sees 2 Amestrians in the middle of this, like camp or whatever. He is like, he's suffering from blood loss. He's completely traumatized and he thinks he's under attack. I'm not saying, that like what he did was like morally correct or whatever, but it's like very understandable that he lashed out and essentially went on the defense, especially given like what he's just witnessed. The series does not really like give any like compassion or empathy to what Scar was feeling in that situation. It's just straight up depicted as, you did this out of revenge, how dare you do this, this was senseless murder kind of thing.
The thing that really sticks out to me about the way that specific scene for Scar is framed is it feels almost like it is a way of meta-narratively, not necessarily diegetically, but from a meta-narrative perspective of delegitimizing his actions. Because until then, we are told that Scar does not kill civilians, and so until that point, you can sort of like basically argue pretty effectively that, hey, Scar was definitely in the right. So then, when it turns out that, oh, no, it's fine. He's actually bad. He killed some doctors, okay? And he didn't just kill any doctors. He killed the doctors of our protagonist's girlfriend, right? Right? He's bad. Trust us. And so that's how I feel about that scene from a meta-narrative perspective. Of again, it was the author's choice to include that scene, and it was the author's choice to frame him, like, as we see, frame his quest as blind revenge and reactionary genocide, as opposed to, like, you know, hey, maybe taking out the apparatus by which the state wages war is, like, not an unreasonable course of action, complicated by the fact that in this case, these are not simply weapons, but people. There's a lot going on here. The show does not do it. Not interested in having those questions.
Yes. All right. And then I think in relation to Scar, I think it's also important to bring up how the show depicts other Ishwalans who are survivors of this war and who have kind of set up.
There's a lot of the trends in, I think for us anime, but like movies too, just in general, of like the number of things that are really, really, really concerned about like the wrong way to fight for justice and less concerned with, you know, actually fighting for justice, right? You'll get like a lot of shows, a lot of stories that are all like, somebody's fighting for justice, but they let anger consume them. You know, they took things too far. It swung back in the other direction. And it's funny how much time we spend like fantasizing about that. I'm like, that doesn't happen. It doesn't. It doesn't happen like in real life. We never get to the point where like, okay, we achieve justice, and then we have too much justice, and it goes the other way. Like, no, it only feels like that to people who like the status quo.
Oh, shoot! I remember the thing. Before we move on from that scene, I want to talk about the way, because the scene in which we learn this, right, is a scene in which Scar is confronted by Ad and Winry, right? The person whose parents he killed. And she picks up a gun and she points it at him. And then Ad makes a thing about how your hands aren't for killing, because I think he references a baby she delivered earlier in the show. Listen, there's a lot.
Yes.
The response to that is like she like puts down the gun after being talked out of it by Ed, because he says, yeah, this is a thing, but you know, the pursuit of revenge has to end somewhere. We can't continue this cycle of vengeance forever. And this is actually the point that marks the change of Scar from antagonist to hero. And it's really interesting to think about the ways in which Scar, dealing with the trauma of the loss of literally his entire fucking civilization, is framed as, you know, eye for an eye revenge stuff, right? I don't want to diminish what it's like to lose your parents, but even that's on like a different scale than like fucking genocide. In that moment, again, the show is establishing an equivalence and using it to delegitimize the anger of its brown character.
Man, 15-year-old me really did not think of this. You know, I went wild over this when I was watching it. I remember good times. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess moving on to the point about so how the other Ishvalans that are set up around Amestris are kind of portrayed and compared to Scar. So I guess there are two scenes that I want to bring up here. So the first is, I think after Scar has tried to go after a state alchemist and failed, and he's recovering from a bunch of injuries. He's kind of resting up in this Ishvalan slum. And, you know, while he's there, there's an elder who's living in that slum, and this elder essentially lectures Scar about being completely consumed by hate, and how his killing isn't the answer. And I acknowledge there are nuances to this, because these Ishvalans are, you know, living in Amestris, they do face these everyday like oppression by like Amestrians that they live around. So there are dangers to them, if there's like a particular depiction of them as being especially like dangerous or something. Like they are very much in danger of being attacked, and they already basically have very little. Again, it's like another instance of the show from the mouth of like Scar's own people saying, oh, you shouldn't be like this angry, or this, you know, that this kind of hate and revenge has to end somewhere, and you need to like sort of stop lashing out, kind of thing. Which is, again, a nuanced take, but not one that I'm particularly fond of.
Yes. Oh yeah. So, and again, I want to like highlight a very important thing, that even if Roy and the other state alchemists, who make up actually a lot of our deuteragonists and supporting characters, are veterans of the Ishval War, and none of them are Ishvalan. So that's not, well, except for Scar, but we've been talking about him. But like they never face accountability for their actions. I want to say that again. They never face accountability for their actions. They feel guilty all the fucking time, right? They feel like total pieces of shit. But if Rent a Girlfriend has taught you anything, feeling like a piece.
That's definitely a point where if Rent a Girlfriend has taught you anything, famous last words on the Critical Weeb Theory podcast.
I don't want to group. I hate grouping them together because the level of quality is just completely different. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, however much of like problematic ideas we have, is still like a good show. And Rent a Girlfriend is garbage, but they still carry the same idea of feeling guilt is equivalent to repentance. That's not true, right? It wasn't true in Rent a Girlfriend, and it is definitely also not true here. Roy and Riza and all of the others, like, no matter how many flashbacks we see of them going, oh no, look at all of the suffering. Oh no, look at all of the suffering, and like crying while people die, makes up for the fact that they were there and they were the ones firing those bullets.
Yes.
While they felt sad about it. And at any point they could have like not done that.
Yeah, and I have like a giant like section about that at the end. And yeah, like it's just, and I mean, okay, to be fair, I guess in one scene they do talk about in the episode that talks about the Ishval War. So there's this sniper named Riza, and she's sort of describing it, and she does say that her and Mustang's eventual goal is to sort of, stay accountable by being declared war criminals after the country has been turned into a democracy. And it's implied that she intends for them to face some kind of like really heavy punishment. I think even like equivalent to maybe even like death, based on how Ed reacts. And I guess but I'll say this later as well. By the end of the series, we don't get what, like, in terms of how the war criminals are like treated and like how they're essentially like heroes still at the very end. We don't get the sense that that's ever actually going to happen. Like, we're not, or at least I personally wasn't convinced by the series that kind of level of accountability was ever going to be a thing.
Isn't Roy like on track to become the next Fuhrer at the end of the show?
Yeah, and there,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he's a nice guy who feels bad about his actions, but being a nice guy who, like, a genuinely nice guy who feels bad about your actions doesn't excuse war crimes. Oh my god.
And it gets worse. It gets way worse when we talk about like, like why, and like Raghav, I think you brought this up too. Like, why the hell didn't they defect and like leave when they kept, instead of just like constantly crying as they like, I don't know, like as they enacted these crimes, and it's just woof. Essentially, like, there's no consequence to defecting, because we see like we have another sort of minor character named Armstrong, and he's a state alchemist, and he does defect. Like partway through the war, he's sent back to Central City, which is kind of like the headquarters of the government for Amestris. He's sent back, and the only consequence that he faces is that he can't be promoted anymore, which is like literally like nothing. Like, that is like not even like a slap on the wrist. Like, it's just nothing.
Yeah, so, like, if Armstrong faces no consequences for defecting, why don't the rest of them defect? I don't get it.
Yes, and actually, like, I think like we can kind of read a reason, and it's a very insidious reason. Over the course of the series, we see Roy and his best friend Hughes. Both of them are in the war. Both of them, fought through the entire thing. Right after the war is over, and like he and like the other, I guess, soldiers and stuff are congregated on this field sort of after the war, and like Fuhrer Bradley is like addressing them at some point, probably. You just kind of see him like standing over them and like being like, oh, this is obviously the antagonist. We see Roy and Hughes have a conversation, and Roy is talking about wanting to become the Fuhrer to stop things like this, aka the Ishval War, happening again. And he specifically says that he wants to rise through the ranks and make it to the top, to stop things like happening. So Duke could have defected. Like, he and his entire, like, all his friends could have defected. But I think, like, it's basically implied that he partook in this genocide to rise through the ranks and not lose his, like, rank, because defecting could have cost him that. To become the Fuhrer and, like, stop things like this happening. Which is, what? Like, goddamn.
Well, it's not just a common trope in media. It is a common trope we see happen with quote-unquote progressive politicians in real life. Like, that's just a thing that happens in which people justify the abhorrent actions they commit to maintain power in the I can fix things, but of course you never have enough power to fix things because you are always biding your time to secure power, and eventually it ends up being the case that you ended up becoming what you sought to stop. And that in your rationalization, you have at a certain point just become the thing.
Exactly.
The things you wanted to stop are the things you are now doing, and sure, you're justifying it by saying, tomorrow I will become a good person. Tomorrow I will change the world. But what happens once Roy becomes Fuhrer and he's like, well, I've got to stomp down these Ishvalan insurgents, otherwise I might lose my title as Fuhrer and be unable to stop future wars. I've got to suppress freedom of speech, or otherwise people might start a revolt and then I'll lose my position and then I'll be unable to do good in the future. Like,
yeah,
it cannot be stressed that this is a thing that happens in real life. It is the way a lot of progressive politicians who end up working within the American electoral system like end up like literally fucking corrupted.
And again, it just lends like even more like disbelief to Riza's point about them, eventually being held accountable. And it also makes the ending particularly more egregious for Roy, particularly because he basically ends up blind, and like his trajectory near the ending is basically he's promoted to a general and he's supposed to be liaising with Scar and Miles to essentially make reparations to Ishval, like restore the Holy Land back to them, and sort of, again, like in some ways like make amends for Amestris' part in the war. But we have we learn throughout the series that Philosopher stones are these, like magical sort of things that help alchemists just become even more powerful with their alchemy, and they're made of human lives, specifically in this case, Ishvalan lives. And Roy is like, so I'm going to allow this Philosopher stone to be, used to restore my sight or whatever, because, this is going to help me achieve my goal of, making amends for these Ishvalans, and it's going to be great, and we, like, everything is gonna, and then, like, I'm going to help them and stuff like that. And it's just, like, literally just, like, in the context of everything else of, like, what he's done, putting aside, the implications of, like, the whole, like, restoring sight thing, it's just, like, you just want, like, your power back, and, like, you can't, like, unless, and especially, like, for the power that's literally fueled by Ishvalan lives, like, you just have, like, it's very clear that he has no interest in sort of relinquishing that power in, quote unquote, in service of a greater good. And
What bits haven't we discussed yet?
Haven't we? I think Miles. Oh, Miles.
Let's talk about Miles.
So yes, to recap super quickly, he's part Ishvalan. He's working within the military, with the state to again, quote unquote, change people's opinions of Ishvalans. So Miles is interesting because he is set up directly to contrast Scar in terms of his actions. So again, like Miles doesn't rebel. His like primary purpose is to try to change things from within. So with Miles, I think we can start off with kind of his general views. Again, halfway through when he's introduced, he has this interaction with Edward, our protagonist. And again, I know like Ed's a kid. He's like 15 or 16, whatever. He's the series' moral compass. You know, the narrative largely supports him and his opinions. So Miles essentially reveals to Ed that he is Ishvalan, that he identifies very strongly with his Ishvalan heritage. He kind of poses a question to Ed about, you must be wondering why I am like working with the military, given what it has done to my people. And Ed, sweet summer child, no. Ed's response is essentially to say, I think we should put our differences aside and ignore race and just get along. And again, Ed is the series' moral compass. He has repeatedly been called out for other things or by other characters in terms of being naive or just plain wrong. But in this case, he does not receive a rebuke for this at all. Miles essentially was like, oh, I admire that very much, and then he moves along. In the manga, it's a little bit different. Like, Miles is sort of, he doesn't say anything, but like sort of in like a panel, you kind of see that he's like uncomfortable and be like, oh, I don't want to explain this again. But the series itself doesn't, in like comparison to other moments where Ed is, objectively, according to the series, wrong and has been called out for it, this is like never brought up again. It basically is just let go.
The fact that not only is Miles like one of the only other POC, well, he's not one of the only other POC because Ling and the others are also there. But I think the fact that Miles' ideology is largely, again, this idea of like do nothing for a long time and then eventually try to change things is I think what ultimately makes him like honestly a bit forgettable. I had forgotten that he existed until I read about him in your outline.
Yeah, so that's a giant yikes moment. And again, it kind of speaks to a lot of his liberal viewpoints.
Yeah.
And so we kind of get an idea of like his position there. So then when Miles meets Scar, he essentially talks with pride about how he was set by an Emestrian on his path, and he says this very proudly, set by an Emestrian on the path to change Emestrius' view of Ishvalans from the inside. And then, and this is super egregious, Scar basically openly like admires Miles for his actions. He says something like, oh, I'm glad there are people like you and I wish there were more people, doing what you do kind of thing to achieve that same goal. And then he condemns himself for his own actions. So he refers to himself as this like festering wound of hatred, which, maybe, and like, I definitely think that Scar deserves to heal and like, sort of start recovering from that.
Yeah. We're not saying that Scar should be traumatized, but he's definitely doing way better than Captain I've accomplished literally nothing in my life. Okay?
Yeah, it's, sorry, no, that's basically it. Yeah, like, it's, obviously, yeah, so, like, there is that nuance that Scar definitely deserves to, again, like, healing and stuff, but that juxtaposition between Miles and Scar's is just so clear here, and again, like, works further to delegitimize his, like, his actions and his very, like, legitimate hatred and hatred of Amestris and of basically all his viewpoints. And it's like, obviously, like, the narrative propping up Miles is correct is like, like dangerous and pretty like irresponsible, considering what it says about just like how to fight against like oppressive regimes as a whole. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing that we've talked about a lot is, and I feel is again worth reiterating, is the narrative doesn't take time to focus on the cognitive dissonance that goes on in order for Miles to rise in the ranks of, let me remind you, the military, right? Because he's gotta commit wait, this is what happens with Suzaku.
Oh, I didn't want to say it, but I was getting My Suzaku senses were tingling. It's getting a little bit of a Suzaku taste in my mouth, you know. Could smell the stink of Suzaku stuff.
No, but it's like that fundamental root idea is still there. That fundamental root idea is still of like, oh, we're talking about how this guy is participating in power structures to gain the power necessarily to change those power structures, but we're not talking about the atrocities they have to commit to maintain that power.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key thing. It's the absolutely key thing.
The ways in which both Miles and Suzaku must, in order to gain rank in the military, violate their own principles.
But these kinds of characters, do they even like? They're never even successful, right? Like, Suzaku doesn't become ruler, right? I haven't seen R2. I don't think oh no. Oh no. Did I just say so? Oh no.
Listen.
Oh no. Okay, we will table that. But Miles doesn't become ruler.
Think of the dumbest fucking shit, and then dumber.
I'm not even gonna speculate how dumb this gets. But okay, so Miles doesn't become ruler, right?
No, he
okay.
Yeah.
So it's just like, what was it for? You know, what was all the simping for? What was all the I have meaner words, but like, what was all like the bootlicking, you know, for the state? Like, what did that get you?
Honestly, like I'm fairly sure textually, like nothing. Like he's put on the reparations project with Scar at the end of the series. But we get next to like no indication that anything he did that he stated his goals were successful by any means. And honestly, like actually to go even further than that, I'd say he wasn't like, okay, so let's say that his goals were, I don't know, like actually worthy in some way. So we have several, so when the climax of the series happens and like all of, like the entire country is essentially like going up against these like monsters who are like trying to get God's power or whatever. It's actually it's like actually other Ishvalans who are like, again, set up around a mistress, and who work with, again, our main heroes and stuff, and like coordinate with other like military like sections all over the country to like sort of help take out soldiers and stuff who are opposing our main heroes. Like Miles basically just doesn't do anything. Like it's like if anyone were to quote unquote change like people's minds or whatever, it's like these other characters on the fringes, the direct survivors of this war, who basically step up and decide to help these people out in the first place. And it's just, just Miles, what are you doing?
Miles, buddy, pal, amigo. You doing good? You haven't even touched your leftism.
What's happening? We still...
Yeah. And so now that we've talked a bit about Miles and the war criminals' redemption quest for justice and the reliance on state to repair relations and fix the harm caused.
There are a lot of quotation marks in this line, by the way.
There are. I was literally about to say that. Redemption is in quotes, justice is in quotes, repair relations is in quotes. And we started talking about this a little, and I think it does deserve a bit more of an exploration. First, of course, as we've mentioned that, again, in order for these war criminals to achieve their ideas of good, they must first commit the harm they seek to prevent. We see this literally as hinted at with Roy Mustang, in which he stays in the military and commits genocide in hope of gaining enough influence to stop committing genocide eventually. And I don't know, man, I think if you do genocide to stop genocide, you've kind of missed the point. But let's talk a bit about, are there any alternatives to what Roy and the others are aiming for? And more importantly, do Roy and the others even succeed in the first place?
It's not really clear. through the series anyway. We know that at the end, Roy and Riza have both been promoted. They still appear to be very closely tied to the military. I think we get like a future picture, snapshot, whatever, of them still like being within the ranks or like carrying out like military actions or whatever. I think it's also important to note that aside from Ishval, Amestris, and part of this is like intentionally set up by the, homunculi, whatever, anyway, but I think it still says something about Amestris's political relations. Amestris is still like very much like it says in the series that they're fighting wars on basically all their fronts. We don't really get any indication of whether that changes at all after this whole like uprising thing, and the homunculi are defeated. Given that the military, and from what we see in the end anyway, given that the military still seems to be very active, and yeah, so it's very active, and like we don't really get any indication of like, people like retreating from like the borders of the other countries sort of surrounding them. It's still, I think, reasonable to conclude that imperialism is still happening, and that Roy is probably still going to be like enacting this stuff, and is probably not going to change in any meaningful way.
So Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood says that the reason Amestris does all of these things is because it was founded by a shitty, greedy, immortal bastard who controls the world from the shadows, right? And not because capitalism and imperialism and the pressures of value extraction naturally result in those processes. And I'm sort of two minds of how to feel about the way Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood treats its corrupt state overall. Because on one hand, it is a corrupt state. It's unambiguously bad. And at the end, people revolt and rebel against it. But on the other hand, after they revolt and rebel against it, as you just pointed out, everything's still sort of there. And that confused me when I first watched the show. I was like, wait, didn't we overthrow the government? Why do all of these people still have their military positions? I'm confused.
Yeah, and like honestly, if like right after like the aftermath of that entire like uprising or fight against the homunculi / father would have been a really good time to actually just like deconstruct everything and like build everything back up in like, I mean, as much of a non-oppressive way as possible. I say that in quotes. I haven't really thought through exactly what that would look like, but they just defaulted back to like the military state, and like again, like Riza explicitly says their goal is to not do that, to eventually turn it into like a more, I don't know, supposedly like democratic state or whatever. But they had a good opportunity right there.
Okay, but listen, we can't. Yeah, there was literally a fucking revolution that overthrew the government. If not now, then when? Listen, kids, we can't have democracy yet. We'll have some democracy for dessert. Until then, you gotta do your fascism.
Yeah, no, just a little bit more killing and then we'll get there. Yeah. Boy.
And as we've pointed out, like, that's sort of the insidious thing. And the other thing to point out is, again, that in spite of the fact that there is eventually an overthrow of the state, our main protagonists almost exclusively are military personnel.
Mm-hmm.
There are no civilians who are crushed by the boot of the state in our protagonists at all, except for Scar.
They did him so dirty. I'm so sad about it.
Scar, boy, they did you dirty.
Yeah, and I guess just, like, the series as a whole, like, honestly, like, I bemoan, like, what it could have been, because, like, early on even, like, it could have, like, made a point about, like, the importance of like counter resistance, like revolutionary action and stuff. But no, it just constantly keeps defaulting back to like, this is great. Our system can be fixed and we can like fix it later. It's like fine. This is fine. And it's just, yeah, it had so much potential.
Everything's fine. Don't do a revolution, guys. I promise things are getting better soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Trustworthy. Bionicle. Big neon sign. Oh, have you not been like...
No, I followed the Bionicle Discord.
Listen, we got shit to talk about. Do we though? I feel like we're nearing the end of...
Yeah, I think we're basically done. Yeah.
That was Full Metal Alchemist. If you like the show, I promise I don't hate you.
Yes. It is. I still love it. Just to clarify. Yeah, it is actually like one of my favorite shows ever. It's just deeply flawed.
It's deeply flawed in a lot of ways that I think are really important to address and understand, lest they create, because this too forms a sort of like, soft propaganda. And even if it's unintentional,
Yes.
like as we've talked about with like the liberal mind prison and like capitalist realism, etc., those two are still like forms of propaganda that perpetuate themselves.
And with kind of far-reaching opinion of Full Metal Alchemist is like really good depictions of, like what it means to like atone for like imperialism, or like showing imperialism in a bad light, which yes it does, but like you said, that soft propaganda sort of echoed through the series is...
It's very individualist, it seems.
So critical thinking and reflection. Yeehaw. Yeah.
Thank you.
Critical thinking and reflection. We're gonna blow your minds with this critical Weeb theory. Mo, I think we should stop doing a semiotics podcast and start doing an anime podcast. It feels like we would have so much more to talk about.
Yeah, totally. What a great idea. Well, Sri, if you want to introduce yourself one more time and maybe plug anything you're working on.
Hello, I am Shri once again. I guess, I can't really talk about some of it yet, but basically, I have a creative account on Twitter. It is at Shriative, or at SRIATIVE. It was an intentional pun on creative. I don't know if anyone got that. I hope you did. And I'm gonna assume that was a no.
Well,
but okay, that's fine.
Listen, okay? Stop me.
Hopefully, if I can actually get down to writing stuff for once, we'll have some stuff coming announced relatively soon, maybe there. But otherwise, it's also just a place to catch me if you ever want to chat or whatever. And yeah, cool. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Digital high five.
Digital high five. Good talk. Good talk. Good talk.
Yeah. Wow, this was really fun.
Mm-hmm.